It's really a pleasure to introduce to all of you who took the time to join this meeting our latest EC distinguished speaker, Professor Renkun Chen. And so he's going to talk about nanoscale thermal transfer and microscale heating. So just a short introduction. And so Professor Chen got his Bachelor of Science in Engineering Thermophysics from Tsinghua University in 2004. After that, he got a PhD in Mechanical Engineering from University of California, Berkeley, 2008. And he did 1 year as a postdoc at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And after that, he joined the faculty in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Aerospace Engineering in 2009 at UC San Diego. His group is mainly interested in fundamental micro and nanoscale heat transfer and also engineering applications spanning from the energy sector to biological systems. So today, the title of this talk is going to be Thermal Transport and Calorimetry at Micro and Nanoscale from Nanowires to Single Cells. So again, thank you to all of you for attending, and thank you to Professor Chen. Now the virtual floor is yours. So just before starting, so if anyone has a question, just feel free to type it in the Q&A part of the Zoom meeting, and then we will go to those questions at the end of Renkun talk. Okay. So you can start.
Okay. Thanks, Alexandra, and thanks for introduction and inviting me for this seminar. Thanks everyone for joining. It's a very kind of unusual time to, for all of us for the last few months, and especially now, I think both California and Texas are leading the nation in the new coronavirus cases. But as you just mentioned, luckily with some sort of technology that could still help us to communicate and discuss ideas and feel connected. And also happy in advance for the 4th of July. I hope you will enjoy your time while also maintaining social distance. Again, I will talk about heat transfer at the micro nanoscale. And my group at UCSD we are in mechanical engineering, so we are mainly dealing with heat transfer. So first, I would like to thank my both present and prior group members and collaborators on our funding sources. All these are necessary to enable the work I present here. And in particular, there are two main students, Sang-Mi Shin and Sang-Ki Hun, whose work I will highlight in this talk. And so you probably have heard this or look at this chart. It's energy flow chart from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. So it's a very busy chart, but you can see the left is the energy supply from different sources like solar, nuclear, and fossil fuels. And if you combine all these energy sources, you'll find out we actually use about 100 quart of energy per year in this country. And this is a very large unit. 1 quart is about 10 raised to 18 joule. And on the other side of the equation is the consumption, which are mainly focused on a few sectors like residential and commercial buildings, industrial, and transportation. So if you look at these numbers, it might feel it's too big, but I can convert it on the personal level that could be easier for us to sort of appreciate. So if you divide this amount of energy over the population of the United States, you'll find out our energy consumption in terms of per unit time, which is power, so it's about 10 kilowatt. So we are constantly consuming 10 kilowatt of power. And again, this 10 kilowatt is distributed mainly among three sectors: transportation, buildings, and industrial processes. And one interesting fact is if you look at how much energy we need to make us survive, and that's essentially based on our food consumption or metabolic rate, and this number is about 100 watt. So we are essentially emitting heat at about 100 watt rate, and we are consuming the food at about 100 watt rate. So you can see there's a disparity of a factor of 100, like 100 watt to 10 kilowatt. So basically, you need 100 watt to make us survive and feel, comfortable. But if you need, but in the meantime, you need 10 kilowatt, 100 times more energy to feel us, to make us feel productive and thermally comfortable. So there's this big disparity. So that really comes into question of why this is important, because we need all kind of different thermal envelopes to make us feel safe, comfortable, and sometimes productive. So one of the more common building thermal envelopes in a building, as we said earlier, it consumes about 35% of primary energy in the United States. And that's about translated to about 3.5 kilowatt per person on average. And we know there's a lot of thermal loss process in buildings, like through the walls and roofs and windows. So we work on windows for quite a bit for energy conservation in buildings. Another type of thermal envelope is at a personal level. Again, we have about 100 watt of metabolic rate, while the building actually consumes about 1.5 kilowatt of energy for heating, cooling, and ventilation. So we also look at personal thermal envelope, for example, using a personalized cooler, in this case, a flexible thermoelectric device. We can see that we can greatly reduce the energy consumption if we use a personalized thermal envelope at a personal level compared to a thermal envelope in a building. And now, if you really go into more details, again, look at metabolic rate per person, and again, it's about 100 watt. But if you divide the number of cells in our body, it's about 40 trillion cells. You'll find out on average, each cell actually produces about 3 picowatt of heat. It's very small heat flux, obviously. And certainly not all the cells are the same. Some other cells, for example, you have brown fat cells, and also myocardial, these are the cells in the heart. They will produce much larger heat flux, and this is on the order of nanowatt in some of these high energy cells. Nevertheless, each cells will produce heat on the order of picowatt to nanowatt of heat flux. And this is the thermal envelope at a really small scale. So we are interested in studying heat transfer process and sometimes even thermodynamic process with these different levels of thermal envelopes. And certainly, this thermal envelope is highly related to heat transfer. So some of you are experts in heat transfer, some of you may not really look at heat transfer quite extensively, but it's actually a very simple concept where you, as we all know, when you have a hot object and a cold object, you always have a heat flux, in this case Q, and the heat flux is related to the temperature difference between the hot and cold object. And this factor here, G, is the thermal conductance that relate the temperature differential and the heat flux. And the thermal conductance G has a unit of watt per meter square per Kelvin. So that's the heat flux per unit area and per degree of temperature differential. So, and obviously, if you have a thermal envelope, this could be a cell, or could be our body, or a building, or a car, and you have environmental temperature T0 and the temperature inside the thermal envelope T1, and there's always some thermal conductance or thermal pathway between T1 and T0, and that will dictate the amount of heat that goes from inside the thermal envelope to the environment. So this is a very simple concept, and a lot of times we actually need to do a different kind of engineering to either increase or decrease the heat flux via engineering the heat thermal conductance G. So in this presentation, I will talk about two different aspects. The majority of the talk will be on the first one. We are going to look at thermal transport in nanostructures at a more fundamental level for transport mediated by both phonon, these are acoustic vibration waves in solid, as well as photon, these are electromagnetic waves in a media. In the second part, I will briefly talk about our most recent work on calorimetry of single cells. We are trying to probe thermal transport process of single cells, as we said earlier, which will emit heat on the order of nanowatt or below heat flux. So for heat transport, as we said earlier, you have thermal conductance G that relate the heat flux and temperature differential. And there are two main heat transfer processes if we don't consider thermal convection heat transfer. So you have conduction and radiation. And in conduction, there's a classical Fourier's law that relates the thermal conductance to thermal conductivity, which is K, and geometry of the material. So if you have the thermal conductance, and if you multiply the length of the material divided by cross-section area of this particular material, you get thermal conductivity K, and that has a unit of watt per meter per Kelvin. On the other hand, if the radiation that could occurs in vacuum or inside a media, and we all know there's a black body thermal radiation law. It's called Stefan Boltzmann law, where the heat flux per unit area is related to force power of the temperature between the hot side and cold side, and it's related to this constant sigma, Stefan Boltzmann constant, and also a material property, which is epsilon, thermal emissivity. And obviously, emissivity can go from 0 to 1. When the emissivity is 1, you have black body. So this is something we can learn from ME undergraduate heat transfer class, which at UCSD is ME 101C that I've been teaching for years. But if you look at the microscopic picture behind this heat transfer process for both conduction and radiation, we know that conduction or thermal conductivity is mediated by acoustic phonons. These are essentially vibrations of atoms along certain directions, and this is dispersion of a phonon, where omega is angular frequency, k is a wave vector, which is 2 pi over wavelength, and this is the acoustic branch of the phonon spectrum, where you can see at a long wavelength limit or small k is more or less linear according to the approximation, and the slope of these dispersions are essentially speed of sound, and we know that speed of sound in typical solids is on the order of 1,000, maybe to 10,000 meters per second. One thing we learned is these acoustic waves that are responsible for phonon transport process in heat thermal conductivity has a very short wavelength. At room temperature is about a couple of nanometers. And on the other hand, radiation, as we know, is mediated by electromagnetic waves or photons, and that certainly has a dispersion of light in vacuum, where omega is, in this case, is proportional to k, where this ratio or slope of this curve is speed of light. And of course, we know that speed of light is much larger than speed of sound, and wavelength for thermal radiation at room temperature is about 10 microns. So there's a well-known Weyer's displacement law that relates wavelength for the maximum emission for both photon and phonon to the temperature and the wave propagation speed c, which could be speed of sound and speed of light. And that would dictate that the dominant wavelength for phonon is on the order of nanometer, while for photon is on the order of 10 micron at room temperature. So these are kind of two important features for both conduction and radiation. They're very different wavelengths, and they're very different speed of propagation. And so if you look at heat conduction, typically we only talk about heat conduction mediated by phonon for thermal conductivity, and you have materials that has thermal conductivity spanning maybe 4 to 5 orders of magnitude. On the upper end is like diamond, which is thermal conductivity on the order of 2,000 to 3,000 watt per meter Kelvin at room temperature. And the lower end, you have polymer and air, which is thermal conductivity on the order of maybe 0.03 for air and 0.1 or 0.2 for polymer. And the reason for this difference in thermal conductivity is mainly determined again by the basic properties of phonon. And we can use a very simple kinetic theory that essentially describes the diffusion of molecules like air molecules. But you can do a similar picture for phonon, where you can treat the phonon as particles. In this case, like you treat electromagnetic wave as photon particles. In this case, thermal conductivity is related to specific heat of phonon or the solid, and v is the group velocity or essentially speed of sound, and L is the mean free path of phonon. So L is dictated by different scattering process of phonon. It could be phonon scattering, that's usually important at high temperature. And if you have a material with impurities or defect, you have phonon impurity scattering, and your phonon electron scattering, that's typically not important. in typical materials. You also have phonon boundary scattering, where you have a nanoscale or microscale grains in crystalline, nano or polycrystalline material, or you have a nanostructures where the phonon boundary scattering is important. So this is a basic picture that will dictate the thermal conductivity in a material. So if you look at a very classical material like silicon, this has been studied fairly extensively in the past maybe decade or so in the heat transfer community. Silicon has fairly high thermal conductivity, about 100 watt per meter Kelvin at room temperature, maybe 100 to 150 watt per meter Kelvin. And people have studied both computationally and experimentally, like what is the dominant wavelength and what's the dominant mean-free path of phonon in silicon. So it turns out these numbers are about a couple of nanometer for wavelength for phonon in silicon. And also the mean-free path is about 10 nanometer to 10 micron. It's a very broad sort of mean-free path for silicon, similar to the black body spectrum for thermal radiation, which is also very broad. And so there was a very classical paper by Deyu Li when he was a student with my former advisor, Luma Jonda, at Berkeley in 2003. What he did is he studied a measured thermal conductivity of silicon nanowires. These are crystalline nanowires with different diameter, like 100 nanometer all the way down to 20 nanometer. What he found is the thermal conductivity dramatically reduced when you have smaller diameter. Again, for bulk silicon, the thermal conductivity is over 100 watt per meter Kelvin. It will be up here. For example, 37 nanometer diameter nanowire, the thermal conductivity is about 20. So that's a very dramatic reduction in thermal conductivity. So theoretical analysis shows that with small diameter in nanowires, the mean-free path L of phonon is more or less controlled by the phonon boundary scattering, which is essentially diameter of the nanowire. So if you look at how phonon propagate in a wire, it will be essentially scattered by the boundary of the wire. So you have a much lower, a shorter mean-free path dictated by the diameter in this case. So, and now one natural question you ask is, if you have very, very short mean-free path, what will be the lower limit for thermal conductivity? And turns out that this lower limit is usually considered amorphous limit. Basically, when you have non-crystalline, fully disordered amorphous material, and your shortest mean-free path L will be only order wavelengths of phonon, because you cannot have a propagation wave with mean-free path shorter than the wavelengths, which will be in the localization region. So in this case, David Cahill and colleagues and Adam Fetterman back in early 90s, they consider this thermal transport in amorphous material. And for example, for silicon, you can do this calculation by taking the lower limit for mean-free path. And turns out this thermal conductivity is only order 1 watt per meter Kelvin for amorphous silicon. So you basically have silicon, the same material. On the lower end, you have thermal conductivity like 1 watt per meter Kelvin in an amorphous structure. On the other hand, if you have bulk crystalline silicon, you have thermal conductivity over 100 watt per meter Kelvin. But you can actually tune these numbers by using different kind of nanostructures. For example, in nanowires, you can reduce the thermal conductivity. So this is one aspect of the story. But however, usually when we talk about thermal conductivity, we don't really consider photon contribution. And that's because photon contribution or radiation is usually not important under most conditions. For example, at room temperature in silicon, the phonon contribution is the dominant contribution. However, if you look at some more complex material that for example, this is some of the ceramic, oxide ceramic material, or in particular high entropy ceramic, like fluorides, pyrochlores. You don't need to worry about all the details. We have papers here, but you can just imagine they have very complex unit cells with different cations and oxygen. And you will see they have very different behaviors as a function of temperature for thermal conductivity. And that really highlights the importance of both thermal conductivity contribute in this by phonon, which is typical in crystalline material like crystalline silicon. You can see thermal conductivity decrease as a function of temperature. On the other hand, you also have thermal conductivity increase from room temperature to like 600 degrees C. This is a typical behavior for amorphous material, but these are all crystalline structures. And when you go to very high temperature, above 600 degrees C, you also see an increase in thermal conductivity. And this is a different region where radiation thermal conductivity is actually fairly important, which is not quite extensively studied in the past. Again, this is because when you go to high temperature, remember radiation has T raised to 4 power. So it's becoming more and more important at higher temperature. So you can really see under certain conditions, all these heat carriers like phonon and something we call diffusion that I will talk about later, also one type of lattice vibration, as well as photons, will all contribute to thermal conductivity in a fairly complicated manner. So I guess that's quite a bit of background. And so I will, with this background, I will introduce some of the work we have done in the domain of understanding different type of heat carriers, particularly in nanostructures. So we have studied nanotubes of silicon, both amorphous and crystalline. We also studied thin films. And the first thing we need to do is to develop a sort of calorimetry platform to enable us to do such thermal transport measurement in very tiny nanostructures. And in particular, the heat flux we deal with is very small. It's usually on the order of picowatt to nanowatt. And so we have developed this suspended thermometry and calorimetry platform for such study. This was built based upon a lot of prior work, for example, by the Li I mentioned earlier, and Li Xu, who is now actually in Texas, UT Austin, and many other people. And we further developed this platform to study things like nanotubes and thin films. And so these devices are more or less similar. So let me give you an example here. You have these thin films or nanowire that can be microfabricated into the device, or you can actually drop cast and transfer the nanostructure onto this device. And you have two thermal reservoirs. On the left, let's say it's a heating side, on the right, sensing side. And you heat up the heating side and measure both the heat flux going through the nanostructure as well as the temperature difference between the heating and sensing side, through which you can get thermal conductance as well as thermal conductivity. And one of the things that we really tried very hard is to improve the resolution of this calorimetry device. And that turns out it's not really easy. We spent quite a couple of years early on, as you can see on these earlier papers, to really improve this calorimetry resolution. And now we can actually measure heat flux with the resolution below 1 picowatt. And that's enabled by a few techniques. One of them is to do modulated heating, where you can heat up the heating side using modulated heat flux rather than just a DC heat flux. And you can lock in this thermometry to the same frequency as the heating frequency, so you can reject a lot of common mode noise as well as ambient noise. So in this case, we can measure temperature down to 50 micro-Kelvin resolution and heat flux down to picowatt resolution. And so I'll show you some results with this measurement technique. One is, again, heat conduction in silicon nanostructures, and the other one is thermal radiation as well as conduction by coupling between phonon and photon or surface phonon polariton in polar dielectric materials. And so this shows some examples of silicon nanotube we measure. This could be both, as you can see here, crystalline silicon nanotube and amorphous silicon nanotubes. And the main feature of this tube is that you can actually systematically change the shear thickness of this tube, say from down to 5 nanometers shown here up to 100 or 150 nanometers. So this is the main result. I skip a lot of details here. I can see this is thermal conductivity as a function of temperature for two types of silicon nanotube, amorphous silicon and crystalline silicon, with shear thickness. This T is shear thickness on the order of 5 to 6 nanometers for all of them. And so, as we said earlier, amorphous material will represent the lower limit to thermal conductivity. However, in this case, we see the crystalline tubes, crystalline silicon tubes, which is shown in the red symbol, actually has lower thermal conductivity than amorphous silicon tube. So, for example, at room temperature, this is about 1 watt per meter Kelvin for crystalline silicon nanotube, which actually is close to the amorphous limit of amorphous silicon at 300 K room temperature. However, the amorphous silicon tube has about 50% higher thermal conductivity on average. This actually is very puzzling. So we have been really looking at this, and we have been puzzled by this like for actually more than 2 years when we look at data and track all our measurements of material to make sure there's really no experimental artifact. And later we found out there are actually both quite interesting stories behind both amorphous silicon nanotube and crystalline silicon nanotube. For crystalline tube, I'll talk about this first. What happens is we also realized that when you have very small tube thickness, not only you have a very short phonon moving path because phonon will be scattered by the surface of the tube, both the inner and outer surface, but you also have impact of the size on the mechanical properties, in specific Young's modules, and that will actually also dictate the speed of sound in the material or acoustic property of the material. So here we measure Young's module of this nanotube as a function of the, also nanowires as a function of nanowatt diameter or nanotube shear thickness, again from 5 nanometer all the way maybe to 60 nanometer. So as you can see, for crystalline silicon nanotube or nanowires, there's actually size dependent in Young's module. So for larger diameter, like over 30 nanometer, you have almost bulk-like Young's module. But when it's below like 25 nanometer, the module is greatly decreased. So for 5 nanometer tube, the Young's module is about 30 gigapascal. That's about 6 times smaller than like bulk crystalline silicon. On the other hand, for amorphous nanotube, we have different size, like 5 nanometer all the way to 40 nanometer. They have a very weak size dependence, maybe from 60 gigapascal to 80 gigapascal. This all fall within the range of thin film amorphous silicon that people measure. So one thing we can learn is this crystalline nanotube has much lower Young's module compared to amorphous nanotube, and it's 6 times lower than bulk crystalline silicon. And the reason for that, later on we did a more systematic mechanic study, even though I'm more like heat transfer person. I work with mechanics colleagues, and we've realized that this inner and outer surface, which has a layer of oxide and a lot of other defects, that will give you a very soft surface layer. The surface layer are very thin, like maybe on the order of 1 to 2 nanometer. But for a 5 nanometer tube, certainly this surface layer will become a very important portion of the entire tube. So as a result, you can greatly reduce the Young's module. Now, how would that impact the thermal conductivity? So you can see here shows, again, the thermal conductivity is related to L, which is phonon moving path, but in very small diameter tube or shear thickness, L is essentially thickness of shear of the tube or nanowatt diameter. So L is proportional to D. Now you can look at the ratio between K over D, you'll find out is proportional to specific heat and speed of sound. And specific heat usually constant. So this is proportional to speed of sound. And this speed of sound, as we know, is roughly proportional to square root of Young's module, square root of E. So we can plot this normalized thermal conductivity over D, which is shown by these red symbols of these nanowires or nanotube we measure. So it's about half for this ratio compared to bulk silicon. On the other hand, if we also plot square root of Young's module, which also what we measure for both nanowires and nanotube, shown by the blue symbol, you'll find out it also reduced maybe by 60% for the smallest nanotube. So they show a very nice correlation between the mechanical properties, in this case, square root of Young's module, and K over D ratio. So that really highlights the importance of this change in mechanical properties on thermal properties in this case. And so this is something we call the acoustic softening effect. So if you look at a lot of different, these are bulk material as we showed earlier, like thermoconductive polymers and diamond, turns out they correlate very well with speed of sound or square root of Young's module. In the case, silicon in bulk is here, but if you make into nanotube, you actually have very low thermal conductivity as well as very small speed of sound. They also correlate very well with this relationship. And as we said earlier, the other side of the story is this amorphous silicon tubes, which is shown by this pink color, is higher than amorphous limit by as much as 50%. Even the size is 5 nanometer. So we did a fairly systematic study to look at the silicon nanotubes from amorphous silicon with tube thickness 5 nanometer to hundreds of nanometer. We also look at amorphous silicon thin films. So this is a result that shows as you increase the size of tube thickness and also the thin film thickness, we actually have increasing thermal conductivity with the larger size, and it can be as high as over 5 watt per meter Kelvin. But this in amorphous silicon, this is actually somewhat surprising. And also there's an anisotropic behavior for thermal conductivity between implant thermal conductivity, like along the tube thickness or the thin film implant direction. Also compared to cross-plane, which is along the thickness of the thin film. So that really shows, if you do with a theoretical analysis, that shows this large anisotropy is due to a very long MIFI paths of these propagons. These are propagating phonon modes in this otherwise amorphous structure. And this propagon has a broad MIFI path only out of, in this case, 5 nanometer, even up to 10 micron in this amorphous structure. And we can also use similar platform to study photon-mediated thermal transport. So as we said earlier, for radiation, it's mediated by photon, which can be described by dispersion of light or electromagnetic waves. And there are a few key differences between radiation and conduction. And for example, of course, radiation usually is wave propagation in vacuum or in certain media, and they are mostly ballistic because you have long MIFI paths and they travel at the speed of light, is much higher speed. However, one sort of disadvantage of radiation is usually not important. As we said earlier, in most conditions, that's because photons usually have very low intensity or low density states because you have high speed, or in other words, you have a long wavelengths like 10 microns versus phonons that have much shorter wavelengths, only out of nanometer. So we were wondering if you could combine all these features of like high speed and ballistic transport and wave propagation with the high intensity in phonon. So you could create a situation where you have photon mediated, thermal conduction. That would be interesting for a lot of applications. And certainly you can do this by coupling phonons and photons. In particular, you can couple optical phonon and photon through surface phonon polariton, as probably many of you are very well aware of, experts in this particular area. So this again is the dispersion of optical phonon. You have a longitudinal LO phonon and transverse optical phonon TO, and you have light dispersion for photon, and they could couple through surface phonon polariton. And for example, this dispersion can be described by this blue curve. That's sort of the coupling between the optical phonon and photon dispersion. And without going into detail, we can actually look at two different modes configurations in surface phonon polariton. In this case, it's a polar dielectric solid material, SiO2 Nano-Ribbon is shown here with width of W and thickness of T, and that's surrounded by vacuum or air. So you can compute the dispersion omega was a K for this surface phonon polariton. And this particular mode is called symmetric mode. And you can see they have much larger K vector compared to light, which is shown here. That means the wavelength can be greatly reduced. For example, from 10 micron, you can shrink the wavelength to below 1 micron. This is a very well known phenomenon for in plasmonic, where you can really confine the energy with smaller wavelengths by surface phonon polariton. And one consequence of that is when you have a nano-ribbon with width, in this case, we change the width from 100 nanometer to around 10 micron, you could have a resonance effect of surface phonon polariton due to the width or physical confinement in this ribbon. And one of the consequences of that is if you look at absorption coefficient or absorption cross-sectional area, sigma absorption, compared to geometrical cross-sectional area, you will find out you can have an enhancement over this geometrical cross-sectional area by a factor of more than 10 or all the way up to over 50 within the spectral range between the TO and LO, which is also called retrostoron band. So within this band, because of resonance of surface phonon polariton, due to the width of this nano-ribbon, we can greatly enhance the effective absorption cross-section area. And we know that emission is the same as absorption. So as a result, you could have high thermal emissivity because of this resonance effect due to surface phonon polariton. So we did a measurement to precisely quantify the thermal emissivity from a silicon oxide nano-ribbon. We know that silica is a polar dielectric. And so we fabricated this device. I will not go into detail, but it's actually based on very simple thermal film model that's in like undergraduate heat transfer, where you have nano-ribbon with this cross-sectional area, but different lengths, say from 50 micron to 600 micron. You can measure a pattern thermal conductivity from one side to the other side. You'll see the effective thermal conductivity is reduced in longer ribbon simply because of radiation heat loss from the ribbon to the environment. So if a longer ribbon, you have more heat loss. So you have a lower pattern thermal conductivity. By doing this, you can use the thermal film model to really extract thermal emissivity. So what we got here is this result room temperature. So if you have thin film, like with infinite dimension along X or Y direction, lateral direction, but thickness is the same as the ribbon, like in this case it's 100 nanometer, and you have thermal emissivity that's actually below 0.1, is much lower than bulk glass because the material is very thin, there's not much absorption. But if you have ribbon with width of about 11 micron and 6 micron, you can actually have enhanced emissivity, say from 0.07 to 0.11, and in a narrower ribbon, you have emissivity about 0.16. So that's about factor 3 enhancement at room temperature because of the narrower width that create a resonance between the surface phonon polariton and the width of the inner ribbon. And more interestingly, as you go to this thermal emissivity as a function of temperature, this is for thin films. This is based on computation, not measurement. And the red is the wider ribbon of 11 micron width. So as a function of temperature, and the green is the narrower ribbon of about 6 micron width. You can see as you go to lower temperature, thermal emissivity actually increases. And that's a signature of this like coherent resonance, because when you go to lower temperature, these optical phonons have longer lifetime. So as a result, they have higher Q factor. This is something you can find out from computation. And you have a sort of a higher degree of coherency. In this case, that will lead to higher emissivity. And the other thing that is probably more interesting that's still understudied right now is the other type of configuration for surface phonon polariton, which is asymmetric modes. So basically, you have two surfaces of this solid, which is silica, and you have instead of having symmetric modes on both the top and bottom surface, you have asymmetric modes, and that will result in this particular phonon dispersion. And if you just look at in this graph, it's actually very close to the light line. But there's a small difference if you zoom in. And what is important for this asymmetric modes is even though they still have fairly long wavelengths similar to light line, but compared to phonon, they have very long propagation lengths. In this case, depending on film thickness, say from 500 nanometer to 100 nanometer, their propagation lengths can be as long as 1 centimeter. Again, if you go back and look at mean-free paths of acoustic phonon, usually it's only order nano. In the asymmetric modes, who have propagation lengths on the order of millimeter to centimeter. So that will contribute fairly significantly to thermal conductivity, simply because you have much longer propagation lengths compared to that of phonon or mean-free paths of phonon. So with this sort of experiment, this is a schematic of the experiment we did. We have essentially very long nanowire. You can really consider this as like optical fiber, transmit signal from one side, in this case thermal signal, on the hot side to the other side, the cold side. So phonon will give you this very broadband incoherent thermal transport for acoustic phonon with short mean-free paths. On the other hand, if you have this surface phonon polariton, they are nano band within the radiative band between LO and TO optical phonons, and they have very narrow band, but they have much longer propagation length, so they could also contribute quite a bit to thermal conductivity over a much longer distance. So you can really imagine this a waveguide for heat in a very similar fashion as optical fiber for light. And so this is one example of the nanowires we made of silicon oxide. In this case, it's a rectangular cross section. The thickness is 50 nanometer, width is 250 nanometer, length is 50 to a few hundred microns. We actually have made up to 1 millimeter long wires. And we can do the same thermal measurement. Let me just show you the result. One of the results we have, there are a lot of other interesting phenomena. I don't know why the slide is moving, but so you can see this is thermal conductivity as a function of length of this nanowire with the same cross-section area. So when you have very short nanowire, then the diffusive transport by phonon actually is dominant. And so you have thermal conductivity of this is about 1.3 to 1.4 watt per meter Kelvin. This is similar to that of phonon in silica, bulk thermal conductivity of silica or glass. But when you go to a longer nanowire, and for example here, especially at higher temperature, when the radiation or surface phonon polariton contribution is important, in longer nanowire, because the surface phonon polariton is essentially quasi-ballistic, you actually have much higher thermal conductivity, in this case over 5 watt per meter Kelvin. So this is more like a factor 3 compared to phonon contribution. And with our theoretical analysis, we can see this contribution is really contributed by the surface phonon polariton. Again, on the surface between the vacuum and the silicon nanowire. I will switch gear a little bit and talk about our recent work on calorimetry of single cells, which is kind of for different type of application, mostly for biology. We have not really dived a lot into biology, but I'm really excited about this work because it could really enable us to do more measurements along this domain in biology. This actually is work that we have done for more than 6-7 years, I guess. We just got the paper published last month. It's a very long process because I realized biology is way more difficult to deal with, even though we are really just sketching the surface. So as we said earlier, so each person has a metabolic rate on the order of maybe 50 to 100 watt, and if you divide it by number of cells, it's about a few picowatt per cell. But there are some cells which have higher metabolic rate, like ground fat cells or these unicellular cells, tetrahymena. They have heat flux on the order of nanowatt per cell. And there are a lot of reasons to study metabolic process in cells. That by cell is a very important subject in biology. Very simple example is if you look at a typical metabolic process, a cell takes neutron, and for aerobic process, you also take oxygen, and then you produce carbon dioxide, water, metabolize like ATPs and other important material for biology, as well as heat. And the heat is a byproduct of this process, and that really tell you the enthalpy change of this reaction. And of course, you also have anaerobic process where you don't need hydrogen. And of course, we all know that you produce ethanol and acid, lactic acid. This is a fermentation process. That's what you have when you brew your beer, for example, or bread. And so if you have an aerobic process, you take, for example, glucose, which is essentially sugar, and oxygen, you produce carbon dioxide, water, and you produce heat. Now, how do you quantify or measure this process? So normally, what you do, the gold standard in biology is you don't directly measure heat because it's very, very challenging. And you measure the oxygen consumption. Sometimes you measure CO2 production, but it's easier to measure. And so, and you can convert the amount of oxygen that you measure to the heat. And this is called oxyocaloric equivalent. So for example, if you have an aerobic reaction where oxygen is involved, then the enthalpy of reaction, the heat generation, divided by the oxygen consumption is about 430 to 480 kilojoule per mole of oxygen. So by measuring oxygen consumption, you can back out and calculate the heat production and understand reactions. So this is great. This is gold standard. However, if the reaction is anaerobic, that meaning you don't actually need oxygen to involve, then the amount of heat generation will be much greater than 480. It could be up to 1,100 kilojoules per mole of oxygen, simply because oxygen does not need to be involved in anaerobic. It's not clear to know in priori, like whether or not you have aerobic or anaerobic reactions. So that really caused some discrepancies in actually quite a bit of discrepancy in the literature if you only use oxygen consumption as the measurement. And similar things can be said for CO2 production measurement. And so that really sort of calls for a direct heat measurement from this reaction, because that's not dependent on any assumption of whether or not the reaction is aerobic or anaerobic. So this is what people have been trying for actually more than a couple of decades. And so this plot shows the state-of-art so-called Bio-Calorimetry, where you essentially create microfluidic calorimetry device to measure heat production from biological and sometimes chemical reaction process. And this is a plot of thermal conductance. This kind of weird scale we did intentionally. So this large number go up, a smaller number. And this is heat flux you can measure for this calorimetry or resolution limit. This is 1,000 nanowatt or 1 microwatt, and this is 1 nanowatt. So it's, again, large number, small number to the right. The best device so far is the device created by Mike Lucas group from Caltech 10 years ago. You could get thermal the heat flux on the order of 4 nanowatt. But it's still not sufficient to measure any single cells, again, because even the highest, the most energetic single cells has a heat flux on the order of a couple of nanowatts. So we set out to do is to make this device and do the measurement. Let me try to introduce this briefly. What we did is we create a suspended one-dimensional microfluidic tube that's made of Teflon, that's made of paraffin, sorry. And then we actually, there's a hollow tube inside where we introduce the cells. And we also create this thermal pile to measure the heat flux and the temperature right at the center of this tube. And then we need to do a lot of thermal insulation and thermal isolation for stabilization to minimize the temperature fluctuation and thermal conduction of the device. So long story short, this is about 5 years of work, but eventually we had created this device that has a conductance of 2.5 microwatt per Kelvin, even with water, and then we can stabilize temperature within about 100 micro-Kelvin for a long period of time, like over 10 hours. So this way, the temperature stability is very important for this measurement. And in the end, we can measure heat flux about 0.2 nanowatt. So this is the first sub-nanowatt bio-calorimeter that people have made. And because of this, we can measure some cells. We have not done a lot of other cells, but the first one we demonstrate is this unicellular cell, tetrahymena. So let me just go straight and show you this measurement process. Hope you can see. So we can introduce the cell to the center of this calorimeter, and we can measure temperature change. And presumably the cells in the center of calorimeter, you have temperature as part of the temperature introduced by the metabolic heat flux from the cell, and then we remove the cell. It's not very clear, but there's a process we have pulse flow. We remove the cell, the temperature decrease when stabilized, which we call base temperature. And there's a small difference between the temperature with the cell and without the cell. And this temperature difference is presumably attributed to the metabolic heat production of the cell. And you can see it's on the order of million kelvins, very small. So it's actually very difficult to measure. So we can measure 3 cells, 2 cells, 1 cell, and as a control, no cell or dead cells which doesn't produce heat. And we can do all this measurement with a lot of cells. Eventually, you can get this plot of heat generation per cell. You can see it's on the order of 1 to 3 nanowatt as a function of size, volume of the cell for different single cells. And you can see there's a nice correlation. In the literature, there's usually a correlation of about 3/4, so-called scaling law. we are not exactly sure if this is 3/4, but there's a positive correlation. And simply because the range of data is not large enough. But nevertheless, this is the first measurement of single cell metabolic rate. And if you look at this, it's actually agree very well with all these scaling laws, with even large animals like mammal animals like elephants down to this, again, here, unicellular organisms. We can also, in real time, change the cell metabolic heat. For example, you can inject an uncoupler called FCCP that will actually amplify the metabolic heat in these tetrahymena cells. So in this case, this temperature or heat flux without FCCP, and then we inject FCCP, you can see the heat flux increase, and then we can remove the cell, this no cell. So in this case, you can find out the ratio of this metabolic heat with the uncoupled FCCP and without is about a factor of 2. This is seems to be reasonable for this type of particular cells. Yeah, so in summary, so I've spent quite a bit of time to talk about heat transfer by both phonon and photon or surface phonon polariton in both silicon and polar dielectric silicon nanostructures. We also briefly talk about calorimetry of single cells. And I think in the future, what we are interested in is to really look at bulk-like material, like metal materials, where the heat conduction is dominated by radiation or surface phonon polariton, where you can do a lot of engineering to take advantage of the features of photons, for example, high-speed, long propagation length, and modulation of photon properties using metal materials. And for the single cell calorimetry, we are currently interested in measuring some interesting cells, for example, brown fat cells. And there's a lot of study about brown fat cells, which actually have very high metabolic rate. And there's still a lot of questions, like in terms of how the white fat cell, which is called white adipocyte, can be converted to brown adipocyte, brown fat cells. And that has very important implications for metabolic process in general. So we are trying to do this kind of studies. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Renkun. Thank you very much. Great talk, great introduction, and very cool measurements and applications.
Thank you.
So we do have a few questions indeed. So I'm gonna take them in the order they've been asked. So the first one is from Sivaram. I'm gonna allow you to talk, so you can ask your question directly if you want. Okay.
It's a very nice talk. Enjoyed it. My question is, looks like the phonon dispersion does change. Okay, from when you go from crystalline to amorphous structures, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And does it also depend? Does it also change with defect density? For example, you can have defects in the crystalline material, and it can behave like an amorphous material.
In general, so it depends on the concentration of defect. Even for amorphous material like amorphous silicon, there's a lot of, not a lot, but there are some recent studies, for example, by Alan McGarty from Cummings Mellon on phonon dispersion. Because strictly speaking, you really cannot define dispersion for amorphous material, but it's not periodic, it's random. But you could really do this with certain approximation. It turns out this dispersion is highly similar to crystalline silicon in the long wavelength limit. However, the lifetime of phonon, because of the lack of this periodicity, the lifetime of scattering or moving paths is greatly reduced, especially for short wavelength phonons. So there's some similarity in dispersion between amorphous and crystalline silicon. So if you have crystalline material putting a lot of defects, so I guess when the defect concentration exceeds certain level, you probably will also alter the phonon dispersion. But for most regimes where you study phonon scattering by defect, the defect concentration is usually very small, like on the order of part per million, for example. Like that's what you have in dope silicon. The dopant concentration is very small compared to is again on the order of part per million. So in this case, the dispersion is usually considered unchanged.
I see.
Yeah.
If I may ask one more follow-up.
Yeah, sure.
The thermal conductivity increases when you go from crystalline to amorphous, right?
Yes, for this very particular case, that's right. So here, but normally it's from crystalline amorphous reduced, like bulk silicon is reduced from 100 in crystalline silicon to 1 in amorphous silicon. But in this very particular case, with 5 to 6 nanometer shear thickness, it's increased maybe by 50% when you go to amorphous. Yes.
And when you make these measurements with nanotubes and nanowires, do you distinguish between K parallel and K perpendicular?
Can you say it again?
How do you distinguish between K parallel and K perpendicular when you do with nanotube?
Yeah, right. So the measurements along the length direction, the actual direction of the wire or the tube.
Is that what you do when you make these measurements?
Yes. So it's along, for example, here, it's along the length direction of the tube or a ribbon. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
God. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Nice talk. Enjoy it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renkun. So we have a few questions also from Hanyu. So let me. You can talk probably. Right?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Great. Thank you very much. So this is Anju from Material Science. Very nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. The first is regarding this particular work about the silicon nanowires. It's very interesting that the Young's modulus X drops significantly both in shells. Do you consider which acoustic mode contributes most to the reduction of the thermal conductivity, or basically no distinction? The reason I'm thinking is it is actually possible to independently check whether the Young's modulus or the sound velocity change by optical means in systems, compare that with the thermal transport measurement, which also includes the contribution from the say scattering rate.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is we don't know. We have not really studied that in detail. So as you know, thermal conductivity measurement we get is a total thermal conductivity that is contributed by all the different modes, longitudinal and transverse. So I think the correlation we did here is very simple correlation where we say V is square root of Young's module, and that's like typical for acoustic, like low frequency, long wavelength phonon, like really acoustic or sound correlation. And this do not necessarily directly translate to high frequency phonons that are responsible for thermal conductivity. Of course, we understand that when you have weaker bonds due to lower Young's module, we have lower thermal conductivity. But we have not really done this detailed study to see which part of the spectrum is reduced by how much and contribute how much to thermal conductivity. Yeah, so if there's a way to differentiate this, I think that would be highly interesting. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. We can probably talk about this in details later.
Yeah, thanks.
The second question is regarding the surface phonon polariton in silicon oxide.
Right.
You showed calculations regarding the lifetime of the asymmetric mode. I can sort of understand that the long propagation is probably because of it's a dark mode, basically no radiation. But these are still like phonons, so the dissipation must still play a role. Do we have a way to estimate that, or you assume that the majority of the energy goes to the electromagnetic wave, so the phonon dissipation is negligible?
Yeah, that's also a great question. So in fact, this calculation of this propagation length already consider the internal dissipation due to the finite lifetime of optical phonon. because you have an optical phonon that's coupled to photon. And photon in vacuum, of course, there's no scattering or loss, but there's optical phonon that's lost inside the solid material due to scattering of optical phonon by different means. So that's already considered in this calculation. Well, in the phonon surface phonon polariton dispersion, there's a parameter called tau, which is the dissipation lifetime. That's essentially due to the lifetime of optical phonons. So that's why you can see the main reason like the propagation length increase when you go to smaller solid thickness is precisely because you have a modes that's propagating both vacuum and solid. But if you're smaller solid thickness, then the loss due to the solid is reduced, and that's why you have longer propagation length in smaller, thinner solid.
Got it. Thanks very much. That's a very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have Geoff. Yes, you can.
Hi, Geoff. How are you?
Hey, Renkun. Great talk.
Thank you.
Since we're on this slide, is the propagation length of the surface phonon polariton sensitive to disorder on the surface, or is it basically insensitive to small fluctuations like surface roughness as you go along the length of the SiO2?
It depends on what type of disorder. Yeah, that's a very important point actually. So if we are talking about, let's say, a clean silica, you have just surface roughness, maybe on the order of nanometer, then the propagation of this mode is not sensitive simply because the wavelength, like a few microns, is much larger than surface roughness. However, again, it depends on the lifetime of both photon and optical phonon. So if surfaces has a defect that are absorbing to photon, for example, certain metallic residues or intentionally metallic coating, which is something we are trying to do, then you can greatly change or reduce the lifetime in this case. Yeah. But just geometrical variation like roughness will not really be too sensitive because of the long wavelength.
I see. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very much. I have also just had one question regarding. So when you showed the increase of the portion of thermal conductivity given by surface phonon when the temperature was increasing,
Right.
Yeah. Here. So here was. Yeah. Can you repeat a little bit? So this temperature is the temperature at which. So what is this temperature?
It's like environmental temperature where we do the measurement. So we do measurement from hot side to cold side. So essentially cold side temperature, let's say cold side temperature 300 K or 350 K. The hot side temperature is maybe a few degrees higher than the cold side temperature. So it's the overall temperature.
It's overall, okay.
Yeah.
I understand. All right. So we passed 4. So I guess for the seminar we can end it here. So I would like to thank you again for the great talk, and thank you everyone, all the attendees that participated, and thank you for the questions.